February 22nd, 2003. The Flint River is black with winter, moving slow and heavy through Saginaw, Michigan. The air is sharp enough to sting lungs. Along the riverbank, not far from houses and ordinary streets, someone notices something that does not belong in the water. At first, it is only a shape, a stubborn blot against the current. Then it becomes unmistakable. A woman's body, half held by the river, half surrendered to it. Her name is Jeanette Wilton. She is 57 years old. If you want more true crime stories told clearly and in full detail, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in the hours before she was found. Your comment matters here because it forces us to look closer. In the first minutes after the discovery, there is no grand narrative, only procedure and shock. A call goes out. Patrol cars arrive. Red and blue lights bounce off bare trees and wet rocks. Officers step carefully because every boot print can destroy another. The riverbank becomes a crime scene. Even before anyone says the word out loud, tape goes up. Radios crackle. A handful of people stand back, silent, staring at the water as if the river might explain itself. When Jeanette is recovered, the violence is not subtle. The autopsy will later describe a death that required effort and time. Strangulation, multiple stab wounds, and blunt trauma to her head and face. 3 different kinds of force. 3 different decisions. Strangulation is close. It is control. It is the refusal to stop even when the victim fights for air. Stabbing is repetitive, deliberate, and often fueled by rage, fear, or an obsession with certainty. Blunt force trauma is domination and damage, sometimes used to silence, sometimes used to punish, sometimes used because the attacker panicked and swung until the world became quiet again. When these injuries exist together, investigators do not treat it like a simple accident that turned tragic. They treat it like a message written in violence. The first question is always the same. Where did it happen? Water is a thief. It steals fibers. It washes away residues. It softens footprints and smears timelines. A body found in a river does not automatically mean the killing happened there. She could have been attacked somewhere else and dumped, or she could have been attacked near the bank and pushed in. Investigators work the scene with a brutal awareness of what winter can do and what the river can erase. Detectives begin building the timeline the only way anyone can, backward from the last known moment. They ask when Jeanette was last seen alive. They ask who she spoke with. They ask what she was wearing. They ask whether she had plans, appointments, errands, routines. They ask about relationships, about family tension, about money, about a recent argument, about a neighbor who fell off, about a car that did not belong on the street. They ask questions that sound intrusive because they are. Homicide does not care about privacy. It digs through it. The family hears the news in a way that does not feel real. One phone call, then another. People show up. Someone sits down hard on a couch. Someone stands in a kitchen staring at a countertop as if the grain in the wood could rearrange itself into meaning. When a person is found dead in a river near home, the imagination becomes cruel. Was she afraid? Did she try to run? Did she know the person who did it? Did she fight? Did she call out? Did anyone hear? Those questions do not fade. They haunt. Investigators have to focus on what can be proven. They canvass the area. They knock on doors. They look for anyone who saw Jeanette walking, anyone who heard a raised voice, anyone who saw a car stop, anyone who noticed headlights by the river, anyone who noticed a figure moving with purpose where no one should be moving. They check the simplest places first, the route she would take to a store, the pops behind houses, the places that offer concealment in plain sight. They look for drag marks, broken branches, disturbed mud, anything that suggests a struggle or a hurried transport. They photograph everything. They bag what they can. They record and label because a case is built from details that look meaningless until one detail finally clicks against another. The early days are a race against time, and time is winning. Witness memory is strongest immediately after an event, and then degrades like a photograph left in sun. People misremember. People confuse dates. People tell themselves they did not see what they saw. Some do not want to be involved. Some do not trust police. Some fear retaliation. Some are simply busy, and busy can kill a case faster than malice. Then there is the evidence problem. In a homicide like this, biological evidence is likely present. Skin cells from a struggle, possible bodily fluids, trace material under fingernails, fibers, hairs, anything transferred during contact. But in 2003, Even when evidence is collected correctly, technology has limits. Some samples are too small. Some are degraded. Some are mixtures. Some do not produce clean results. Some produce partial profiles that cannot be matched to anyone. And without a match, DNA can feel like a locked door. You know the answer is on the other side, but you cannot open it. The case becomes what so many cases become, a file that grows thicker while certainty stays thin. There are tips. There are theories. There are names. There are people investigators look at and people the community whispers about. But suspicion does not hold up in court. A jury does not convict because a person feels wrong. A prosecutor cannot file a case on atmosphere. Law requires weight, and weight is made from evidence that can survive cross-examination. Here's pass. Life continues in the most offensive way possible. It continues. The river keeps moving. Seasons keep changing. People in Saginaw go to work, raise children, argue about bills, attend holidays. And the unsolved murder of Jeanette Wilton becomes a quiet bruise in the background of local memory. Her family does not get that luxury. They live with a permanent split, life before February and life after. Every year that passes adds another layer of grief, not only for the loss, but for the unanswered question that sits beside it like a second death. Cold cases have a particular cruelty. They are not active enough to feel hopeful, not resolved enough to feel finished. They exist in an in-between state where the family hears we are still working it, but months and years pass without movement. Over time, detectives transfer, retire, or die. Witnesses move away. Some witnesses stop answering phones. Some key witnesses develop illnesses. Some forget. Some are no longer reachable. Even when law enforcement remains committed, reality changes the landscape around the crime until it feels like the past has been sealed under concrete dot, and yet the past is never fully sealed. Evidence remains. A swab remains. A preserved item remains. A sealed bag in an evidence locker remains. And when technology advances, the past becomes testable again. At some point, investigators look at Jeanette Wilton's case with fresh eyes. They treat it not like a story that failed, but like a story that was paused. They pull evidence that was collected long ago and ask a new set of questions. What can modern testing do that older testing could not? What items were never tested because resources were limited? What items were tested but produced inconclusive results at the time? What items might yield something now if examined with better methods? This is not glamorous work. It is often paperwork, inventory, chain of custody review, careful repackaging, and decisions made with a sober understanding of contamination risk. A single mistake can destroy the value of what is left, but when it is done correctly, it can resurrect a case. Modern forensic analysis can separate mixtures more effectively. It can detect smaller amounts of genetic material. It can draw usable profiles from traces that used to be considered too weak. Databases have expanded, meaning a profile that once matched no one might now match someone. And even if it does not match directly, it can sometimes create investigative leads that point toward a person, a family line, or a social circle. In the world of cold cases, a DNA hit is like a flare in darkness. It does not automatically solve everything, but it shows where to walk next. When a suspect is finally identified, the case changes shape instantly. Investigators stop asking who could have done this and start asking how does this person fit. They reconstruct his life around the time of the murder. They examine where he lived. They check employment records. They map relationships. They look for connections to Jeanette. They look for history, prior accusations, violence, sexual misconduct, restraining orders, patterns of behavior. They interview people who knew him then and now. They look for inconsistencies, lies, missing time, anything that matches the crime's demands. Eventually, a name emerges publicly: Jason Cabello, a 47-year-old man from Saginaw, former city employee, a local person, not a faceless stranger from out of town. That detail alone hits hard because it reshapes the psychology of the crime. When a killer is local, he did not need to learn the area. He already knew it. He knew where he could move without being noticed. He knew what streets were quiet. He knew how to blend. The accusations against him are severe. They include criminal sexual conduct and murder. The case is not presented as a simple homicide. It is presented as an assault and a killing, tied together by forensic work and the story investigators believe the evidence supports. Arrest does not mean the story is complete. Arrest is the beginning of the legal war. From that point forward, everything becomes about proof and persuasion. The prosecution has to do more than suspect. It has to show. It has to demonstrate to a judge and then to a jury that the evidence points to the defendant, and that it points there so strongly that reasonable doubt collapses under the weight of it. The defense has one primary mission: create doubt, not because the defense must prove innocence, but because the state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In cold cases, defense strategies often focus on time, the long gap between crime and charge. They highlight what was lost. They highlight what changed. They highlight the possibility that evidence was mishandled, contaminated, or misinterpreted. They highlight that memories are unreliable after decades, and that early investigative mistakes can never be corrected because the moment is gone. So the courtroom becomes a place where the past is rebuilt with fragments at preliminary hearings. The public often hears the first structured presentation of what the state believes happened. Witnesses describe the testing. Experts explain what was found and why it matters. Detectives summarize the investigation's arc, from the scene in 2003 to the forensic work decades later. The defense questions procedures, challenges assumptions, and searches for any weakness that can later be expanded into a king and dot in this case. The public outline emphasizes DNA evidence as the central connecting thread. That means the state believes there is biological material that ties Cabello to Jeanette Wilton, in a way that is not casual or explainable by innocent contact. It also means the state believes it can defend the chain of custody and the testing methods, because without that, the DNA becomes vulnerable. But DNA, even when strong, rarely stands alone in a compelling trial story. Jurors want context. They want motive, opportunity, connection, a reason a person would do this, and a way the person could do this. A purely scientific case can win, but it is stronger when the science sits inside a believable narrative. So investigators look for the human link. They look for anything that connects the accused to the victim: a social connection, a family connection, proximity, a prior interaction, an earlier incident that never became a report. Often, in older cases, the most important connections are things nobody thought mattered at the time, because nobody knew they would matter. If the prosecution can show that the accused had access to the victim, knew her, could encounter her without raising alarm, and then place him at the center through forensic evidence, it can create a story that feels tight. The defense will attempt to cut that story apart, to isolate the science from the narrative, to argue that presence is not guilt, and that assumptions are being smuggled into the case through emotion. Then there is the question of intent. In many homicide prosecutions, the difference between degrees of murder becomes a battlefield. Premeditation is not always a long plan. Sometimes it is argued as a decision made in moments, but it still requires proof of thought, of choice, of deliberate action rather than pure impulse. Prosecutors look at the manner of death to argue intent. Strangulation is often used as an indicator because it is sustained and requires continued pressure. Multiple stabbing can be argued as continued decision. Blunt force can be argued as an added act. A combination of methods can be presented as proof that the killer was not acting blindly, but acted with the purpose of killing and ensuring death. The defense may argue the opposite, that multiple injuries can occur in chaos, that violence can escalate without planning, and that the state is reading intent from wounds in a way that is more emotional than scientific. They will argue that intent is a mental state, and mental state cannot be proven simply by counting injuries. And in the background, always, is the river. The river is a character in the case because it complicates everything. It complicates timing. It complicates what evidence survives. It complicates what can be reconstructed. It complicates certainty, but the river also did something else. It kept the body in a place where it would be found. It did not carry her away into a void. It returned her to the world, and the world had to acknowledge what happened. The family's experience, through all these years, becomes a second story running beside the legal one. For them, every stage of the renewed investigation brings mixed emotions. Relief that something is happening, anger that it took so long, fear that it could still fall apart, the terror of reliving details they never wanted to imagine, and a quiet, stubborn hope that justice is not dead just because time passed. When a case finally moves toward trial after decades, it creates a unique kind of pressure. The prosecution must present old evidence with modern clarity. The defense must challenge that clarity without looking like it is attacking science itself. Judges must control what is admissible, and jurors must translate technical testimony into a simple conclusion, guilty or not guilty. This is where the documentary lens matters, because in true crime storytelling, It is tempting to treat a suspect's arrest as the ending. It is not. It is the point where the state commits publicly to its theory. From there, the system tests that theory under harsh rules. If the case proceeds to trial, jurors will likely hear about how evidence was stored and preserved. They will hear about lab protocols. They will hear about statistical weight. They will hear about controls used to prevent contamination. They will hear about whether profiles were partial or complete. They will hear about mixtures and how analysts interpret them. They will hear about what can be concluded and what cannot. They will hear the defense attempt to stretch every uncertainty into a possibility of innocence. They may also hear from people who knew Jeanette Wilton. Those testimonies are not only for emotion. They establish routines. They establish last known contacts. They establish vulnerability or strength. They establish what was normal, which helps the jury understand what was not. A victim's life matters in court because it shapes context, and context shapes plausibility. And Jeanette's life, from what can be understood, was an ordinary life in the way most lives are ordinary. She lived in Saginaw. She had family. She was not a headline seeking attention. That is what makes her death feel especially brutal. It is violence crashing into normality. The suspected offender's life becomes relevant too. The prosecution will try to show patterns or behaviors that align with the crime. The defense will try to show normality, steady work, community presence, lack of violent history, or any explanation that weakens the state's narrative. Both sides will select details like weapons, and the truth will be fought over in fragments. There is also the psychological question that often sits beneath the legal one. Why would someone do this in such a violent way? The combination of strangulation, stabbing, and blunt force is not neat. It suggests escalation or obsession. It suggests rage or panic. It suggests control. It can suggest sexual violence. But psychology is not proof. It is only interpretation, and in court, interpretation must be anchored to evidence. The most reliable anchor remains physical evidence. And when physical evidence points strongly in one direction, it tends to dominate still. Cold case prosecutions require a special discipline. They must acknowledge what cannot be known. They must not pretend the past is fully recoverable. They must show the jury that despite missing pieces, the remaining pieces form a picture that is clear enough to convict. That is the state's burden. For the defense, the missing pieces are the weapon. They will emphasize that years passed without an arrest for a reason. They will ask why, if the suspect was present in the community, the case did not move sooner. They will argue that the state is now working backward from a DNA result and building a story around it, rather than finding a suspect through traditional investigation and then confirming with DNA. They will argue that the scientific match is being treated as destiny. The prosecution will respond. That technology changed, not truth. That evidence collected early was preserved correctly. That the inability to identify a suspect earlier was not the same as proof of innocence. That a case can be stalled by limitations, not by lack of guilt. That the correct person can walk free for decades if the evidence cannot yet speak. And that when it finally does, the law has an obligation to listen. In the documentary, you also have to face the uncomfortable possibility that more than one truth can be present at once. That the system worked hard and still took too long. That science is powerful and still not perfect. That families deserve closure and still must endure uncertainty. That suspects deserve a fair trial and still may be guilty. What makes this case stand out is the span of time, more than 2 decades between death and charges. That span turns the story into something larger than one homicide. It becomes a story about evidence and patience, about how violence can hide inside time, and about how the past does not stay buried as easily as perpetrators hope. Picture the killer. In the years after 2003, living ordinary days, buying groceries, watching television, going to work, laughing with someone, driving past the river, maybe thinking about it constantly, maybe never thinking about it at all. It is difficult for normal people to imagine that a person can commit a murder this brutal and then continue living among others. But it happens. Some offenders are haunted. Some are not. Some are only haunted by fear of being caught, not by what they did. Some tell themselves stories until they believe them. She deserved it. It was an accident. It was not me. I was forced. I was drunk. It did not happen the way they say. The human mind is an expert at self-protection. Then imagine the victim's family, also living ordinary days, but with a constant wound. They do not have the luxury of rewriting the event. They only have the facts. Jeanette is gone. She died violently. Someone did it. They do not know who. And every year that passes is another year the person who did it is not paying for it. When the arrest comes decades later, it is not pure relief. It is also rage. It is also grief renewed. It is also fear that it might end without conviction. It is also the horror of seeing a name and a face attached to the crime, because the mind can tolerate an unknown monster more easily than it can tolerate the idea that a real person from the same city could do this and then blend back into the community. As proceedings move forward, the case becomes a public story again. People talk, news spreads, old acquaintances of the accused wonder whether they missed signs. People who knew Jeanette replay memories. Some community members become certain of guilt immediately. Others insist on presumption of innocence. That split is part of every modern true crime case, the tension between emotional certainty and legal certainty. Legal certainty is slow. It demands process. If the judge determines there is enough evidence to proceed on serious charges, it means the case has crossed another threshold. The state will prepare for trial. The defense will prepare for trial. Motions will be filed. Experts will be retained. Evidence will be challenged. Timelines will be argued. The words reasonable doubt will hang over everything like a fog, and the brutality of the original crime will return. Because it cannot be separated from the question of guilt, jurors will hear how Jeanette died. They will hear about strangulation. They will hear about stab wounds. They will hear about blunt trauma. They will see diagrams, photographs, or descriptions that will make them uncomfortable. That discomfort is not incidental. It is part of understanding the stakes. Someone did this. If the person on trial did it, he must be held. If he did not, then the real killer is still out there, and another innocent person is in danger of being punished. The documentary truth is that both possibilities must be respected until the evidence is fully tested. That is not softness. That is discipline. At the same time, discipline does not mean neutrality about violence. It is possible to speak clearly about what happened to Jeanette Wilton without pretending it is just another story. She was killed in a way that suggests cruelty and force. Her body was left in a river. That is not a puzzle to be enjoyed. It is a tragedy to be understood. The question, then, becomes whether understanding can become justice. In the end, every cold case has two endings. The legal ending, where a verdict is read, or a plea is entered, or a case collapses. And the human ending, which is never fully clean, because even a conviction does not return the dead. It only names the guilty and acknowledges the wrong. Jeanette Wilton's case, after years of silence, returned to the center of attention because something finally connected. Something preserved from the beginning survived long enough to speak. And now the system is attempting to translate that speech into accountability. On the riverbank in 2003, investigators were fighting the enemies, a killer and time. The killer hid behind water and darkness. Time hid behind forgetfulness and limitation. For a long time, time seemed to win, but time has a weakness. Time does not destroy everything. Sometimes it only delays the moment when the right tool finally exists, when the right test finally works, when the right match finally appears, and the story that was stalled begins moving again. If a jury ultimately hears this case, it will be asked to bridge the decades with evidence, to look at what survived, and to decide whether that survival is enough to convict the person accused. Until then, the case remains what it has always been at its core, a woman taken from her life near home, a community marked by an unsolved murder, and a family that has waited through seasons, through years, through an entire generation of time, for the simple human act of an answer.